welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by Beyond Science. We want to have a conversation today about the importance of connections in terms of setting up a project for translation. And if you go to the next slide, Sam, we all know that the road to translation is a complex one. There's lots of hurdles that we need to jump. And if you look at the skills base that's required to do that, it's obvious that no one person or no one group could do that by themselves. And so what we're looking to do is bring to you some different perspectives today so that we can understand the breadth of these challenges, but also not to be frightened by that breadth, but to realize that we have support in many different ways around connected networks that are available to join that can really help us to, from the start of the journey, plot the path to translation. And on the next slide is our panel for today. Lance from the Liverpool Innovation Precinct will be telling us about the need, amongst other things, and identifying that need in a journey and the project planning and how the need is so critical to success. Laura Poole-Warren from University of New South Wales will give us the researcher's perspective, and Stuart with MTAA will give us the commercial perspective, and then Payal will give us the clinical deployment perspective. So it should be an exciting journey through this, and we'll explore all of these different options. And then, as Sam said, towards the end, please put questions in, or as we go, put questions in the chat, and then we can have a bit of a conversation at the end of this. So without any further ado, we'll move on to Lance, and Sam will hand over the screen sharing to Lance. And we've all been doing this. It'd be like a Hollywood production. This would be so smooth. And the screen is all yours, Lance.
Yeah, it's my task to step you through identifying the need, which is obviously of significant importance. And in particular, whatever you're looking at, identifying that need, and that in particular that unmet need, which is ultimately the cornerstone of innovation. Okay, so you're being innovative, but not meeting a need, you're not solving a problem or delivering value, then that can be fun and enjoyable, which in itself is not bad. But if you want other people to be interested in what you're doing, in particular investors, then you need to be delivering some sort of value. Now, the best way to find unmet needs is to simply be around people. It's the theme of today in connecting with people. So speaking to people, being around people, people who are attempting to get some sort of job done, and connecting with them and essentially observing. In the case of health and hospitals in particular, very complex organizations, very full places, it's a great place to be observing people trying to get jobs done. And in fact, Western Sydney University, who's another one of the Liverpool Precinct members, actually funds a biomedical engineer in residence. And their job is to simply be in the hospital, Liverpool Hospital in this case, talk to people, observe them, identify problems, identify things that can be improved. Now, what someone says they need isn't necessarily the problem that needs to be solved. As we all know, healthcare professionals are very motivated people. They're clever at developing their own workarounds to problems that they're experiencing because they want to get a job done, and their jobs are really, really important. Taking the time to understand a need really deeply is a really valuable exercise, and that requires you to investigate widely. So if you're in that situation, if you can at all, resist launching into what you think is the solution straight away, because it may not actually be the problem being solved that needs to be solved. So when I mentor startups, largely in medical devices, one of the things I get them to do is construct what's called a stakeholder map. the best way I can describe a stakeholder map is like a mind map, but it's focused on all those different stakeholders connected to the issue that you're looking at. So again, in healthcare, that can be quite extensive. You've got clinicians, nurses, allied health, finance, could be IT, suppliers, and certainly don't forget patients or funders or insurance companies. Connect with them all to try and understand the whole situation better. Because while you're wanting to solve a problem, what you don't want to do is create a problem for someone somewhere else. So you need to understand all those perspectives. What you really want to be doing is testing your assumptions. And sometimes you're assuming things and not realizing it. So in talking with people, in interviewing people, you're trying to uncover what that unmet need is, and noting that an unmet need is unmet for a reason. And so it's never as simple as you think it is. So what I get people to do is try and prove your assumptions wrong. And if you can't, then, that's a good path to be on. So ethnography is a specialty within anthropology. I bet you didn't expect to be going into anthropology this afternoon, but is a way to understand the situation better. If I just give you this, it's a really interesting quote because it comes from health within the UK government. And the part to really pay attention to there is the bit that says observing people within their own environment. And so for a researcher or an engineer, any of us, it means trying to understand a problem from someone else's perspective, not your own. And that can often take quite a bit of discipline and thought. And then when you're with these people, be curious, observe them, watch what they're doing, ask questions, try and understand why they're behaving in a certain way. So remembering, you want to uncover the real problem to be solved, and the real need, what they're telling you, is not necessarily the need that needs to be addressed to solve. And you may have come across this quote in the past from Henry Ford, that if he'd asked people what they needed, they would have said faster horses. Right? Finally, some needs are unstated or actually unknown. Quite tricky to uncover, but you can by connecting it and being with people. And so, as I said, it's really important to spend time with people to try and uncover these things. And I finish with a real life example. So quite a few years ago, I was involved in a project with a new CPAP device. And people who don't know what a CPAP is, it's basically a medical device that sits on the bedside table or nightstand. Patient breathes on it as they sleep, and in most cases, it's plugged into mains power. About 9 to 12 months after this product was launched, a report came in of a device up in Japan, which was brought in not working and signs of burning inside the case. Any signs of burning, doesn't matter what it is not good, but it was just one. And then about 6 months later, a second report came in of a device which was brought in with the same issue, and the user was commenting on a burning smell coming out of the device. So things like that, 2 is enough to be a trend. So it was investigated. And as you would know with medical devices that are mains powered, it's really important that the cord can't be pulled out by accident. And some of you will know, in fact, that there's actually a standard for a minimum pull force that needs to be met for the power cord. And this device was designed to meet that standard, of course. Now, it turns out in Japan, the bedrooms are a bit smaller, the nightstands are a bit smaller. Culturally, there's a reluctance to kind of put their health issues out on show. So the users up there were actually disassembling the device in the morning when they woke up, which included pulling the power cord out. And as we all do when we've got a cord that's hard to pull out, we kind of wriggle it and twist it to get it out. And they were doing the same thing, wriggling, putting it back in again to set up at night. The assumption was that users would leave the cord connected, pack it up, put it away, or even just leave it on the bedside table. As it turned out, what was happening is when the Japanese users were pulling the cord out, they were cracking a connector inside the device, which was then arcing. Because we'd assumed that the device wouldn't be pulled apart like that, we never queried that. We just assumed all devices would be used the same way, and it wasn't. And so that example was really around certainly a design issue, but it wasn't designed for a particular use case or a particular context. And that particular user group wasn't observed in how they actually use the device. So it's definitely worth taking the time to interview, observe people, try and get excited about ethnographic research because it can be very revealing to identify those unmet needs. Because if you don't do that and you get it wrong, you can end up with something like this. So clearly the need might have been something about stopping head injuries in car accidents, but clearly there wasn't enough observation about what happens in those situations, and you don't want to get yourself into something like that. And thank you very much for that. Back to you, Gordon.
Great, thank you, Lance. What we'll do is we'll go through all of the presentations, but please, if you think of any questions, just put it into the chat as we go along, and we'll come back for a bit of a conversation at the end of the presentations. So thanks again, Lance, and we'll move on to Laura Poole-Warren, who's going to give us the researcher's perspective.
Wondrous. So this is all about connectivity, and I really wanted to start off by introducing myself and just telling you a little bit about where I'm coming from. So even though I'm a professor in biomedical engineering currently, I've also spent a bit of time on the TGA. So I was 10 years on the Therapeutic Goods Administration Expert Committee on Medical Devices. I also had 2 years as a preclinical scientist in industry, and currently am co-lead of an innovation platform of a clinical academic organization. So although I still am focused on research in my current role, I've had a bit of insight into how the innovation pathway proceeds. My research focus is in the neural interfaces, in particular looking at bionic devices. And in terms of other things, I'm a director of the Tyree Institute of Health Engineering with my colleague, Professor Nigel Lovell. And that organisation we started almost 3 years ago through a generous donation from the Sir William Tyree Foundation. And really what the Institute is all about is about connecting unmet needs with co-designed innovations. So I think, it's a great example of connectivity and how connectivity can work. So if you think about, and I just want to sort of, emphasize what Lance has just said, this sort of graph here is showing you that basically the number one reason startups fail is no market need. And certainly in the medical area, the medical products area, that whole area of unmet clinical need and looking at product market fit is absolutely critical. And a sort of a close second, just to give you an idea, is funding. So funding is obviously an issue, and the team. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those aspects, but I also want to then come back and talk about some of the challenges that academic researchers have. So need is critical. I think we all agree on that. And I think from an academic researcher perspective, we tend to get very excited, in particular in biomedical engineering, about the technology. So, new technology, developing new ways to solve problems is something that we get really excited about. But we have to almost flip our thinking and start to actually think from the perspective of the healthcare professionals. What do they need? And not just go out and say, here, I've got this new widget, I'm sure you need it, but actually start with what do you need and have that needs pull. So once you've defined that and validated it, then it's around understanding, can we actually then get together a group to develop the technology to meet this need? So it's a sort of it's a nuance on how we actually conduct our work currently. and it's flipping it around. So the need is driving things. And in terms of connectivity, I think one of the key things in the medical space that's really important to do is to not just look at this from a technology perspective, but it's to get together users, practitioners, and technologists with other stakeholders to actually work collaboratively to design solutions. So that's really where co-design comes in. And so when you're actually thinking about innovation, and I don't expect everybody to read all the words on this, it's really just an illustration of a mapped out innovation pathway. This came from CIMMIT, the links on this slide, so you'll be able to follow it up later. But basically what this is doing is saying, these are all the things that need to be achieved when you're taking this journey from invention through to translation and commercialization. And all of the things in pink down the bottom of this slide, so each of the columns is an area. So you start with need, you end up with clinical use and standard of care. All of the things in pink are related to the technology. Everything else is related to the clinical aspects, market and business aspects, and regulatory aspects. And you can't do one without the other. So you absolutely have to pull everybody together and have a team that's going to manage all of the activities in a really cohesive way. And that's really, really difficult when you're either a clinician working alone as an entrepreneur or a researcher working alone as an entrepreneur. And you really do need to form connections to actually progress along this pathway successfully. So from the researcher perspective, there's a number, in my opinion, of researcher challenges, and I'm thinking from a biomedical engineering perspective, so this might differ from some of you, but one of the first things that I think academics always have to think about is career metrics. So if I want to stay in academia, how am I actually going to get a continuing role, progress my career? And really it's an emphasis on publications and high quality grants, and they're often the category 1 grants. That's changing a little bit, but it still is a really, really strong driver in promotion. Then when you're actually trying to get grants in this space, there is a big gap between the Australian Research Council and the NHMRC. So the NHMRC funds medical research, the ARC doesn't fund medical research. And when you're actually doing technology research, which has a medical application, it's really difficult. And you do get caught between the gap between the ARC and the NHMRC. I think it's also, and I think Stuart might allude to this, but certainly there is the so-called valley of death, which is challenging for us as academic researchers to get funding to support early stage ideas and incubate them to the stage where they can then go on to success. And time is another thing. Again, you're trying to mix together your teaching and your research and your service, and time to actually engage in being an entrepreneur when perhaps the outcomes and outputs take a long time and aren't easily measured is quite challenging. And then finally, one of the things we always hear from our academic colleagues are we don't have good access to clinical collaborators and industry knowledge like the market and regulatory knowledge. So really, getting yourself in a situation where you can have easy access to that expertise is absolutely critical. And I think, to cut a long story short, the solution is use the ecosystem and join or assemble a team which has a lot of the different disciplinary needs to actually take you down that innovation pathway. And I'm going to finish up now and just let you know that if anybody does have an unmet clinical need or an idea for a healthcare solution and they want to reach out and catch up, they can actually use this QR code and contact us, and we'll see what we can do to help. So thank you very much, and I will pass on to Stuart.
Yes, thank you, Laura. And as I say, please put those questions in the chat, and we'll just kick right along with Stuart and some thoughts on the commercial aspects of translation and planning research projects. Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Lance. What I'm going to look at here is perspective around what the investors want, what the funders want. Before launching into the presentation, there's a key message to really reinforce, and it's been delivered by both Lance and Laura. Investors, funders are interested in the problem that you're solving. Is this a big enough problem? Is this a large enough problem? Is this an intricate enough problem that is worthy of the technology you're seeking to deploy against that problem? There's enough funding that's been lost in terms of technology in pursuit of problems. Start the other way around. See to understand the problems that you can actually solve. What I'd like to go through in this presentation, should I be able to get my slides to work, is firstly introducing the Medical Technology Association of Australia. The MTAA is the peak association representing medical technology manufacturers. We look after both the large and the emerging, as well as the established growth businesses stage of the market. So those three sort of key phases. We support industry growth, and I'm specifically responsible for that for both grants programs, clinical trials, as well as access to funding, both grant delivery, as well as the private capital markets. We inform policy, we particularly inform policy at a Commonwealth level around regulatory, reimbursement, market access. And we also support advocacy at the Commonwealth and state levels. Some of our members who you might want to have a look at are very much these organisations here. So some established plans, as well as some various sort of emerging companies in that sort of bottom left corner there. My background prior to supporting MTAA with their grants program in industry development was more of the corporate advisory capital markets piece. So the observations I'll share are somewhat data intense here, but we're able to get a perspective around what is it that sort of attracts investors to the healthcare sector. So I wanted to start in terms of Australian venture capital trends. Australian venture capital as an asset class from a fund manager's perspective, which is important for researchers seeking to commercialise their work, needs to understand the trends towards healthcare. And healthcare is that sort of orange box you can sort of see sort of moving through here. In terms of the number of deals, it started off quite low around 2010, moved through to some interesting deals numbers in 2017-18, and then has spiked over the past few years. In terms of the quantum of funds invested, we're now looking at around $500 million, so $500 million going into the sector in 2022. Now, I like to break that down and further understand the difference between biologics, pharmacology, as well as medical devices. But before we do that, we need to understand, again, the investment trends around different sort of aspects. You're seeing that the life science and the pharmacology piece is taking up the majority of this funding. In 2022, it was 11 deals out of 28, and it was $260 million out of $450 million that went into venture capital into the medical sciences space. The second area of most interest was obviously the health IT kind of space. Diagnostics, medical devices, and medical manufacturing are unfortunately quite low in their relative aspects. In terms of medical devices, you're looking at roughly $85 million relative to that sort of 450 in 2022. Another observation to share is that a lot of the Australian funding goes to offshore medical device companies rather than here in Australia. So this is where there's reliance on high net worth investors who come into projects on a case-by-case basis. In terms of the devices specific activity, which is where we are interested in, we're looking at a lot of the funding coming through in that later stage growth businesses. So that means that you need to rely on that gap between NHMRC Medical Research Future Fund funding that will help you get to certain stages around your concept development, to then finding other funding that's going to help you get through that regulatory, reimbursement, market access, and procurement stages. Coming back to projects that we know are more successful than others, it's those that have a strong clinician lead element as part of the team to help define the need to solve, the problem to solve. We're also looking here in terms of the second chart was funds available for medical device commercialization and domestic VC funding. In 2022, there was a premium of funding, but however, the average is typically around sort of $32 million. What we're also seeing, however, is that it takes something like 400 to 500 mil to get 10 deals up and running. So we're seeing a real gap in the availability of venture funding here. Further, what we're seeing is incredible amounts of money going into the research activity in terms of federal and state government, as well as the higher education, as well as commercial-led research versus commercialization funding. So the observation here is to find industry partners to partner with rather than to seek that commercial venture funding, just the simply availability that's out there. What we also want to share with you is an understanding of how the multinational medical device companies and pharmacology companies source their innovation in Australia. The first lesson is it's a very competitive market out there. The multinationals will typically bring to market concepts that have been developed in their home markets, whether that be the US or Europe, but in general, they are agnostic to where they source those innovative technologies. It must be solving a great problem, and it must be step change different in either patient outcomes, which is the primary aspect, and secondary, the healthcare economics position. Australian medtech companies do have a strong reputation for class 3 devices, so cardiac, neurological, and orthopedic tend to be the active implantables. And we also have a strong regulatory TGA framework established by the Clinical Trials Notification Scheme. So we do have some advantages here. The challenge we have, however, is the tyranny of distance. So how is it that we can work with groups such as the Beyond Science Initiative, as well as MTAA Connect, as well as ourselves at the MTAA, to get you in front of those multinationals, both here and obviously in their markets. The distinction I want to draw out between pharmacology and biologics is that pharmacology is essentially an investment or a venture funding bet on the research phase. And that's where traditional venture funding looks for a large outcome, $1 billion plus unicorn, but it's also prepared to accept that only one in a portfolio of 10 to 15 companies may ever reach that outcome. Medical devices, however, you need to go through the research, development, and commercialization risk to actually prove that first in market, you're in your first market, and you do have a level of general acceptance by key opinion leaders in that market. So it's an investment in research, development, and commercialization. Typically, however, devices are more successful in actually achieving a valuable exit over pharmacology. So it's a different aspect of the investment class you look to. The message for that is that for seeking funding, understand what the funders' drivers are looking for. There are groups that are heavily active in the medical sciences space, but they do not actually invest so much in devices because that's not their fund mandate. So understand investor funds mandate, understand almost the need you're trying to solve for that group. This comes back to a key sort of message. Investors are not one single homogeneous group. They can be broken down into angel investors, venture capital fund managers, driven by and governed by strict mandates. High net worths also fit into this space as well in terms of the quantum they can invest. And then the strategic investors, typically where they invest at different and later stages. I think these slides will be available at a later stage. So if you wish to dwell on this in your own time, please do. The last slide I'll look to was in terms of key messages. In terms of crafting your investment pitch, look to 4 key behaviors: fear, greed, envy, sloth. The two key motivators are fear, losing your money; greed, we want more. Sloth means you have such an attractive investment opportunity and you're only raising to a point where folks are interested. Folks know how much you need and it's only available to a limited audience. It means that those coming in at a later stage are prepared to pay more to actually get their access to greed. Sloth means let's rely on third parties to make that investment decision for us. I'll skip over this slide. Feel free to review it again in your own time. But it's looking to how do you actually build an investment product targeted at those different audiences based on the key behaviors. You're best to work with some of the innovation accelerators. University of New South Wales, where Laura is at, has Health 10X. I'm sure Lance and Gordon have their own innovation support programs. So feel free to tap into your audiences there or groups there to help you construct that investment proposition. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Stuart, for those additional insights. And we'll kick right along, and Payal is going to give us the clinician's perspective.
Thank you. That was just so much wisdom in those talks. I'm hoping that I'm just going to come in the end and stir the pot for discussion. So I've been asked to speak about the clinical environment, and it is important because Australia has been touted to be the go-to destination for clinical trials. You know, it is what we do really well. And so to understand what makes this tick and what makes this untick, we need to understand what drives clinicians. So there's a lot of fallacies about what makes surgeons, you know, really stressed out, why they don't engage in research. One is long hours, and I can say that I say to you that's a fallacy, because every junior doctor knows very well how to work long hours without peeing or, you know, eating. Otherwise, they don't get onto a training program. Life and death decisions, part of our bread and butter of training program is how to respond to emergency. There's no greater thrill in medicine than to be able to save someone's life. So it's actually something that's quite rewarding rather than something quite stressful. But you'll be surprised that even more than bullying and harassment, the RACS 2018 census showed that what stresses surgeons the most is administrative processes. So if somebody calls you during the middle of the day, you know, you have to protect an hour of your time in between clinical care to talk to the ethics committee about an ethics application, that is very stressful. And then if you don't have time to do it, that's also very stressful. So as a result, Australia's thriving clinical trials ecosystem is really very good at industry-sponsored clinical trials and extremely poor at investigator-initiated clinical trials. And of course, that is helped by the fact that we have regulatory exemptions for clinical trials, certain clinical trials. So it does make it a mecca. So, you know, how do we change this? How do we get clinicians more engaged in the system and connected with the system, so we can make sure that innovation is connected to real life needs? It's important to understand that for clinicians, their clinical priorities always comes first, and the clinical academic pathway, which allows them to protect time for research, they're not commonly funded, and the academic pathways. It's difficult to raise funding because you don't even understand what a typical academic pathway is, even by clinicians. So the NHMRC did a large survey to look at the myriad of clinical pathways that clinician researchers take. And they found that there was, you know, quite a degree of flexibility, and some continue to do research, some don't. Some may obtain a higher degree early, some may do it later on in their career. They found that majority of them found it very difficult to pursue a dedicated research career. And even though a lot of them had access to advice, they found that it wasn't necessarily, you know, helpful. And there were some certain barriers. The major barrier was funding, and also, you know, not being connected to be able to see employment opportunities. So not having the right advice, not having access to time, and of course, money. In addition, there are clinician researchers who are proceduralists and who are non-proceduralists. And so it's important to understand that, you know, on top of your clinical care, there's a whole lot of non-technical work that you have to do, such as your advocacy, administration, and some of them are mandatory. And on top of that, if you want to maintain your clinical competency, the clinician researcher, well, a proceduralist needs to be at least in 50% of academic work. For non-proceduralists, that can be reduced down. But if you take that model of academic pathway to a university, this is often the type of response that you get. So it's difficult to raise support for this group. And most clinician researchers are then engaging in clinical trials funded by industry. So to get clinician researchers engaged in translational research, it's even tougher because, you know, there's such a small group, you know, you can't grow the workforce because what you can't see, you can't be, and what you don't understand, you can't support. And so here lies an age-old problem. And so because funding has become so difficult, our academic workforce has overall become more hyper-specialized, and they've become excellent at knowing a lot about very little, which means that we get disconnected to real world needs. We lose visibility of the big picture. And, you know, why is this important? Well, we've seen when we are hit by a massive crisis in our health system, which requires rapid pace of translation, we really struggle because those building blocks of interconnectivity are not there in our workforce. And some of you may think, well, you know, the pandemic's passed, you know, what's the problem now? But I can tell you that the health system continues to be in numerous surges of crisis. And it's certainly, there is a lot to have to work through. And so that need for interconnectivity is even more important now. Not only that, we're faced with a health system that is financially struggling as well. And so governments are pivoting to make sure that whatever funding is being put into the health system, it really is structured to deliver value to the patient. And therefore, you know, you may well spend 10, 20 years trying to develop an innovation to get to market, but if it's not cost effective and it's not delivers value to the health system, it's not going to get funded by the state or the federal government. And many of you will know that the prosthetic reforms that have occurred and is continuing to be rolled out. And so the only way to make this change is really, as all of the speakers before me have so well articulated, is that we need to be interdisciplinary in the way we conduct research. We need to be interconnected. We need to learn each other's skills. So when we are developing, you know, solutions, we're able to leverage off that network a lot better. And overall, you know, Australia is a very small nation. We have, compared to, you know, some other countries, we have limited research dollars, and there's a lot of duplication of resources that is, you know, happening that we can prevent to make ourselves a more efficient ecosystem. What the benefit that Australia has is that Australia is a small country. It has a small workforce, and therefore it is easier for us to interconnect. And you know, what surgical researchers have as a disadvantage, being, you know, having to do numerous roles, is also an advantage because we are very good at playing in teams, and, you know, complex teams, simple teams, you know, we embrace it. So I think it's important for our capability building initiatives to also connect with our health system education. Just exactly how, you know, I learned so much even just to listen to the previous speakers in front of me, and it just shows that we're constantly learning. There's more to learn. And I think it's a no-brainer because ultimately we all have a common goal. We all want our innovations to get to our patients in the most time-effective manner. But ultimately at a human level, it's the people who are making a difference to other people. And so to enable that one person to make a difference to another human being, we all need to get together and try. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Payal. Thank you to all of the presenters for those amazing insights from very different perspectives. But I think it just reinforces, as we said at the start, how, you know, what a complex journey from fundamental research to translation might look like, but that you know, all the hurdles are jumpable, and the skills are around to help each other to jump over them.